thank you for your attention. I've asked Dr. Perry if he'd like to say a few words before moving to Q&A. He will say a few words, and then I will give you the ground rules for the questions and answers. Bill?
It was just a little over 4 years ago that the Schultzes and the Drells and the Perrys had a social dinner one evening in Palo Alto. And in the course of that dinner, George Schultz noted that the 20th anniversary of the Reykjavik summit was approaching. That was the summit, as described in the film there, where President Reagan and President Gorbachev actually discussed the idea of eliminating nuclear weapons. At the time, this idea was ridiculed, but we thought it was time to revisit the idea. So we decided to organize a seminar at Stanford on the 20th anniversary of the Reykjavik summit. We did that. The conference turned out to be highly successful, and at the end of the conference, we decided to write an op-ed piece expressing our view that this was the time to eliminate nuclear weapons. George Shultz invited Henry Kissinger and Sam Nunn to join us. And so it ended up being the four of us writing the op-ed, and we were almost immediately dubbed the Gang of Four. The first public step taken by the Gang of Four was this op-ed, and to our surprise, it attracted worldwide attention. We published another one in January of '08 outlining the steps to reach that goal. We had meetings in London and Oslo and Rome and Berlin and Moscow and Delhi, Tokyo, all of them focused on this subject. Groups like ours, other groups of four, were formed in these other countries. But to this point, all of this was what we call track 2, or unofficial. There had been no government actions at all to that time. And of course, for anything really to happen in this field, the action has to be taken by governments. Then, in April of 2009, a miracle happened. I considered it a miracle. Just 3 months after he was elected, President Obama made his famous speech in Prague. To quote for you the key line from that speech, he said, "I state clearly and with conviction America's commitment to seek the peace and security of the world without nuclear weapons." The video that you just saw told the story of why we were pursuing the project and what has happened. Since the movie was released, the New START Treaty was signed between President Obama and President Medvedev. The movie, which you just saw, was premiered in the White House. The President hosted the meeting, invited the four of us and our spouses to attend, and showed it to all of his senior cabinet officers. Before the movie started, he told them this movie and this thinking has had a profound influence on my thinking, and it should have a profound influence on your thinking. After that happened, the Nuclear Posture Review was released with explicit support of a world without nuclear weapons. The Nuclear Summit was held in Washington with more than 50 nations attended, all focused on the question of how do you get better control of fissile material. All of these events happened this last spring, and some wags in Washington have referred to it as a nuclear spring. This summer, the Senate began hearings on the New START Treaty, and the first two witnesses were Jim Schlesinger and myself. So we are off and running. But what remains to be done is much, much more difficult than what has been done. The first thing that has to be done is the ratification of the New START Treaty. And to my total amazement, this, to me, absolutely non-controversial treaty has got some opposition in the Senate. It's not a majority of the Senate, but it's some. And as you probably all know, it takes 2/3 plus 1 to ratify a treaty. This particular Senate hasn't had 2/3 agreement on any issue that's been brought up. So on that basis alone, I can see we're going to be in for kind of a tough slug. But we will soon know, because the plan of the leadership is to bring that treaty up for ratification during the lame duck session in December. The ratification of that treaty is absolutely essential to moving forward. If the United States does not ratify that treaty, we have lost all of our hopes of being able to fight any leadership. And if the United States does not provide any leadership, this whole initiative will just stop dead in its track. If we do ratify it, then the next step will be ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty this next spring. That is much more controversial. In fact, it was turned down by the Senate in 1998. So we have a much tougher job ahead of us getting that treaty ratified. Now, I tell you this because some of you, when I present this film, have asked me, what can I do? What can we do? The first thing we're trying to do is get public awareness of the problem. Very few in the public are indeed aware of this at all. I hope what you can do immediately, aside from the obvious view of supporting the ratification of these two treaties, is get the word out. And the best way you can get the word out is take a copy of this video and hold a meeting yourself in your home, in your club, in your church, wherever. Show the movie and get a discussion stimulated about what's going on, because we need to get the word out that this is a serious problem and that the next two steps in moving forward on this problem involve the United States Senate ratifying these two treaties. One of them is up in December, and the next one is going to be up next spring. Now, with that background, Harold, I think we should turn it over for the Q&A.
Thank you, Bill. Let me just quickly remind us all that we only have about a half hour. Therefore, the questions should be brief. And I'd like to point out that they should be questions. Questions have a funny symbol at the end and a dot. So there's a question mark at the end of the brief question. Either Dr. Perry or myself will recognize the speaker. Jennifer Barris and Mark Levin have radio frequency microphones, which they will hold in front of you for a brief while, and then they might take them away if the question's too long. As a matter of courtesy, I hope each of you will give your name. Feel free to give your affiliation, and Dr. Perry should feel free to answer at whatever length he chooses. So I'm open for questions. Yes.
I can speak loudly if that's okay.
Well, I want to see if the microphones work.
Okay. My name's Joe Garrett. I went to graduate school here. I'm a retired banker. My question is, having just read 3 of Herman Kahn's books, not light reading, would he support your initiative if he were alive today?
That's a hell of a good question to which I don't know the answer. He was a very unconventional thinker, and he might just very well have supported them. This is the kind of unconventional thinking that he liked to grasp. So my bet is the answer to that question is yes, but I cannot be sure.
Yes, ma'am.
Hello, I'm Susan Blackman, the daughter of Nelson Blackman, yes. Who was a colleague of yours.
Colleague of mine, yes, many years.
And my question is there any way to tie your initiative to something that would help deal with our deficit, so create some sort of economic incentive for Congress to sign it, so that maybe some of the other, like you were doing some things of, we paid off Eastern Europe to get rid of their weapons and it become a fuel source. Is there some way in which you could create that, a jobs or stimulus or income creation thing, so that, that might get some more support and buy-in?
Susan, again, that's a good question to which I'm afraid I do not have a very good answer. The things we have thought about doing along that line, which have to do with the getting the surplus uranium from the nuclear storehouses and nuclear weapons and blending it down, that is an income-creating program, but it's relatively small compared to the size of the deficit and compared to the size of the recession we're dealing with right now. I think the answer to your question is no. We can do things that have positive economic value, but they're relatively small compared to the size of the economic problem the United States faces today.
Yes.
Yes, my name's James Shen. I'm a retired diplomat. I used to work on some of these questions at the State Department. My question is the question of the hair trigger alert. I think the country is just not aware at all that we are still on that status. And I was wondering on that particular issue, which seems to me should be readily explainable and get a lot of public support for getting off that hair trigger alert, what can we do, what has been done, and what could be done to make people much more aware of that one particular item?
What we're trying to do in that item is just incorporating it in this film and then trying to get as wide distribution as possible for the film so that the word gets out that this is a serious problem. Besides the danger of a terrorist getting fissile material or getting a bomb, there remains the danger of an accidental launch, a launch that's made by miscalculation. I described to you one very real incident during the Cold War. There's just no reason at all why we had to bear that risk today. And the best thing we can do is as I said, is indicating the film, is to get both the United States and Russia to get our missiles off quick launch status.
What is the status of negotiations on that question?
I think probably the best thing that we can do is to move unilaterally and by example. The danger is not so much that we will launch in a false alarm. The danger is that the Russians might launch. And therefore, we can unilaterally, by taking our missiles off alert, we can ease their concern on that issue. So I think there are things we can do unilaterally. Having done those things, there's no reason why we cannot include it in the discussion that Obama and Medvedev have on arms control. They can also include these discussions. There have been, in an earlier era in history, during the Cold War, the two presidents did have discussions along these lines. President Clinton and President Yeltsin, for example, agreed to de-alert, or to de-target our missiles, which meant that even if they were accidentally launched, they would not be launched at a target. Some people ridiculed that by saying, well, they de-targeted them, but in a matter of seconds you could retarget them. But the purpose was only to give each side comfort on the fact that an accidental launch would not be targeted at them. Other questions?
Michael Knott. That's okay.
Father Mark Watson. I'm actually a priest from northern Louisiana. And my question is, have you had any dialogue with the Christian community, and I would say especially as a Catholic, with the Conference of Catholic Bishops? Because, I know they've written 2 documents on peace in the 80s, but I don't think they've spoken enough for peace and especially nuclear disarmament.
Yes. We have had 2 different sets of dialogues, one with the Catholics and one with the evangelicals. The Catholics with Brian Hare, who has been a major factor in thinking on issues of this during the Cold War and is still very much involved in the issue. And the evangelicals, I met just a week ago in Los Angeles at the annual meeting of the National Association of Evangelicals, the NAE. And we had an abbreviated version of this film. We had a long discussion about it, much as we're having here. And it is my strong impression of that meeting that the evangelicals as an organization and the churches within them will work very hard to get the message out and will be very supportive. It's particularly important because many of the evangelicals are conservative politically, and we desperately need some support on the conservative side of the political aisle as these treaties get up to the Senate. And I got a very strong commitment from the evangelicals I talked to in Los Angeles that they themselves would try to influence the political outcome on these Senate hearings on the treaties. So yes, it's a very, very good question, a very important part of our initiative. And so far we're getting very strong support both from the Catholics and from the evangelicals.
Michael?
Hi, I'm Michael Nacht, a professor here
Hi,
at
Michael.
Berkeley, and just back from the Pentagon. First, just let me compliment you on the extraordinary service you continue to perform for this country in this
Thank you,
and many other areas. It's really
I should compliment you on your service too. Michael has been
it's
one
a
of the
footnote compared to
stellar.
what you've done.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Among the many issues, obviously, the President is grappling with is the Iranian nuclear weapons capability and how it is developing. How do you see the evolution or resolution of that issue impacting on this global effort?
Tell me the issue again. I missed
On
that.
the Iranian nuclear weapons capability development. The President obviously is seeking ways to discourage Iran from moving all the way toward a nuclear weapons capability. He's had a year of reaching out. We now are in a year of sanctions. Where do you see, not that where do you necessarily see that going, but how does that issue itself interact with building support globally on the broader issue?
I am exceedingly worried about the nuclear developments in Iran. I do believe, but can never prove, that we had an opportunity about 5 or 6 years ago to negotiate an end to that program. But at that time, we were refusing to talk with the Iranians. I think that was a big mistake. That mistake has been made. I do not think we have the same opportunity today. I see the Iranians moving ahead and not likely to be persuaded not to move ahead. I believe that we have the potential of stopping that program diplomatically, but it would require coercive diplomacy. They're not going to just give it up on jawboning. The coercive diplomacy that could be successful with Iran is financial diplomacy, cutting them off at the international banks. They are highly vulnerable to that kind of pressure, and I think it's likely it could succeed, but for it to succeed, it would require all major nations agreeing to do it. The United States has agreed to do it. Europe has agreed to do it. Russia probably would agree to do it. The big question mark is China. But if we could get China and Russia into that agreement, I think we probably would have a diplomatic way, a coercive diplomatic way of stopping the Iranian program. Now, if we do not succeed in that, the program will be stopped anyway, but by a different approach, and that is, I have no doubt that the Israelis will launch an attack on the Iranian nuclear facilities if they believe that those facilities have reached the point of no return on nuclear weapons. That attack will probably have a good degree of success in significantly slowing down the program. But it will have a whole host of unintended consequences, nearly all of which are bad and some of which could be tragic. In my way of thinking, if I were in the government negotiating this issue now, I would be discussing with the Russians and the Chinese the alternative to diplomacy being a military attack and the unfortunate consequences that accrue from that. So that is why I'm so concerned about this problem. I have been concerned for many years about the North Korean problem, but there's no X factor in that equation like there is in the Iranian. And that X factor in the Iranian is the Israelis' likelihood of launching an attack on the facilities. I make that statement with some confidence that it is correct. I've discussed this with senior Israeli officials. I've discussed 2 different times. I've had meetings with Iranian senior officials, including their national security advisor. I think I know where their program is headed, and I think I know what the Israelis will do if we cannot stop them. Everything in my mind hinges on successful diplomacy, and that hinges on getting China into the picture.
Yes, and then Professor Falcone.
Hello, thank you again for what you are doing. I'm Mary Steiner, and I've attended 2 global forums, one in Moscow and one in Rio de Janeiro for the survival of humanity. And it was fantastic to see the global support for coming together, both religious and scientific and parliamentary leaders. So it's out there, and it's just waiting for our leadership, and this is a really, really exciting time. I wanted to know, though, in our own backyard, who is the opposition in the United States Senate? Who are these people?
The leader of the opposition in the Senate today is Senator John Cowell from Arizona. I'm not forecasting that he's going to vote no, but he certainly has been presenting all of the reasons why you should not vote the treaty. It's possible that the president will be able to bring him around between now and December, but what's not clear about Senator Cowell is the extent to which he's really opposing the treaty and the extent to which he's putting up arguments against it in order to get concessions. And the concessions involve primarily promises from the administration of things they'll do to support the nuclear program. But in any event, he is the face of the opposition right now, and I have no doubt he's going to be a substantial, formidable opposition to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, whatever he does on the New START Treaty.
Roger?
Roger Falcone from physics here at Berkeley. You've stressed the political aspects of moving toward the world without nuclear weapons. There might be a technical aspect to it, and my question concerns the response of the national security labs, so-called weapons labs. They have to certify the reliability of the stockpile each year. Do they have a role here at all?
Yes, they do. I should tell you that in the interest of full disclosure, that I have been for many years on the Board of Governors of Los Alamos and the Board of Governors of Livermore, the chairman of the mission committee there, and Harold Smith is another member of that mission committee, so we are very closely involved. I have just, for reasons, just recently resigned my position on those 2 boards and the mission committee, so I'm no longer on it, but I have been for many years. It's my opinion that the 3 laboratories have moved far enough forward in scientific computing and in other means of simulation that they can, with confidence, verify the stockpile without testing, and even as we go through this transition period of decreasing the stockpile. When we get to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the lab director is going to be asked to testify, and I'm hoping they'll say something comparable to what I've just said, but I'm not sure. They have. It's one thing to say I have great confidence in our simulation, and the other thing to say I'm completely confident in the simulation. They have to certify by law. They have to certify the reliability of the stockpile each year. I think myself that our scientific expertise at those laboratories is amazingly good. The facilities, the computer facilities, are the best in the world. And I think they will be able to do that. And I think that the lab directors will, with at least a reasonably high degree of confidence, be able to say what I've just said. Harold, would you like to comment on that question?
I'd like to just broaden the question slightly.
Okay.
The laboratories are a great resource of science and technology related in one way or another to nuclear weapons. Verification technology, that is, to detect where nuclear weapons might be, is going to be extremely important if there's a world without nuclear.
Yeah.
I think the laboratories will play an enormous role there. I know they want to. Bill, would you want to?
No.
Further questions? Yes.
Hey, I'm Chris McDermott, an undergraduate. I just saw a poster for the movie in a library that I frequented, so I came here. In the movie, all the steps for limiting nuclear proliferation are very logical, but its actual initiation seems difficult, especially, looking at our own Senate. Do you have any proposition for actually initiating instead of just saying just do it? Like, where do you really see the beginning?
I'll give Harold a chance to comment on that too, but to me, everything is tied in the next 6 months to the ratification of these two treaties. Now, I should be very clear, I do not think the New START Treaty is that important in and of itself. The reductions it makes are quite modest. It's not that it's so important, but the failure to ratify that treaty will be enormously important. It will take away any right at all for the United States to be in a position of leadership. We cannot make things happen in the world, but our leadership is required in order for these things to happen. And it has to be leadership not by telling people what to do, but by example. So our example can mean a lot in the world, and if the example is negative, that will mean a lot too. Harold?
I'll just make one short comment. The British government in the last 3 months has made what I think is a major step in the direction that Bill Perry has been talking about. Namely, the British have reduced their arsenal to a specified published number. It's about 260, if my memory serves. It's only one type of weapon, and it will be deployed on one of 4 nuclear submarines, a few of which, probably 2, will always be at sea. That's about as safe a nuclear arsenal as one can have, assuming they're not on quick alert as Sam Nunn said. But would the United States and Russia be willing to go down that same path of a single weapon deployed in a fully safe way? Will we be willing to, and will NATO be willing for us to withdraw our weapons from Europe? And as Sam Nunn proposed, George Shultz proposed, actually destroy those tactical nuclear weapons. Well, those are major steps. And they are shimmering there on the horizon. The British have taken theirs. Will other nations, particularly the announced nations, take theirs? I don't know. But I think there's a reasonable chance they will. In other words, Bill's initiative, I think, is beginning to get some steam. But that's only one.
Let me add one other point to that. About a year and a half ago, the Australian and the Japanese government formed an international commission on nonproliferation and nuclear disarmament. I was the American member of that commission. The commission met for about a year. It concluded last December with a meeting, appropriate enough, in Hiroshima. But we issued a very detailed report which basically answered your question. What are the steps next? How do you go step by step to getting down to zero? And it's not, if you look at the technical problems involved and as well as the political problems involved, it's not all that easy and not all that quick. We laid out, taking those into account though, we laid out a series of steps which involved, among other things, the United States and Russia, each of them dismantling and eliminated 500 nuclear weapons a year for the next 10 years until they were all gone. We looked at the facilities necessary for dismantling. We convinced ourselves that this was a practical proposal. And so in that document, which is available, by the way, on the web, you can get it on the web, and it's International Commission for Nonproliferation and Nuclear Disarmament is the key word to get onto the web. It lays out a very detailed program for how you can go from where we are today to that position. But I go back to what I said in the first place, a prerequisite for any of that happening is getting these two treaties ratified. Nothing will happen without that.
Further questions? Yes.
Sir, Joseph Daniel, grad student and naval officer. do you know of any studies within the U.S. military about how many Ohio-class submarines we need, or if say we don't need any ICBMs? And would that be helpful if Admiral Mullen just said we can get rid of all of our ICBMs, all of our B-52 based bombs, etc.?
Yeah. That's not I must say, not a consensus in the U.S. military, but it is a view of two senior and two responsible military officers. I tend to agree with that view. That is, I think in this reduction, that's a reasonable goal to head for and to get head for rather quickly. And to get back to Harold's point, probably the simple way to do that is totally eliminate ICBMs, totally eliminate bombers, and end up with a rather small force in submarines, as the British have done.
Yes.
My name is Benjamin Boudreau, and I'm a graduate student here. Do you believe there's any role for missile defense for achieving your goal of a world with no nuclear weapons?
I'm still open-minded on that question. In November, actually that's next month now, November, we are holding a conference at Stanford called Deterrence in a World Without Nuclear Weapons. And one of the questions, specific questions they will be looking at, as you get to a number very close to zero, does a missile defense system give countries the security they need against the possibility of a breakout I don't know what the answer to that question is. I'm inclined to think no. But that is one of the questions that will be seriously considered. We'll have several papers presented on that, and I'm sure there'll be a fulsome debate on that question. My own view is that the ballistic missile defense systems directed towards strategic missiles are a negative factor in this whole equation, not a positive factor. But I'm willing to open my mind to consider what happens when you get down to close to zero. Does the equation change at that point? Harold, do you have any view on that question?
I do. I have serious doubts that missile defense against a sophisticated missileer will ever be effective. So I've been on the negative side of missile defense for some time. Secondly, the weapon that the Gang of Four fear is not missile delivered. It's a terrorist weapon. It comes in a truck or a boat. Missile defense has nothing to do with that. So if times are tough, and I'm rather certain times will be tough in the coming decade, I personally don't think that missile defense is going to provide the kind of protection that its proponents think it will. As I say, I'm speaking more as a technician than as a strategist. I know I saw a young man back there.
Hi, Victor. I'm an undergrad here. I know that we want to go and sign the treaty to go and kind of show the world that we're willing to take steps. But within the United States itself, is there anything stopping us from disarming, like right now? What blocks that?
No, I think there are a number of steps we can take in unilateral nuclear disarmament that do not require waiting for a treaty. One of them, for example, would be eliminating all of our non-strategic nuclear weapons that are in Europe and in the Asian theater. Another much of the focus has been on the number of weapons deployed. But beyond the weapons deployed, we have thousands of weapons not deployed that are not counted by the treaties. So we could begin a major move to start dismantling all of those weapons. We're talking about we have more weapons in that category than we have deployed. So we could make a major move towards unilateral nuclear disarmament. politicians, the international politicians, seem to believe that if we start unilaterally dismantling our deployed missiles, it will decrease our leverage to getting the Russians to do the same. I'm not so sure that's right. But that's another thing we might do, is simply announce to the Russians we're going to go from whatever the number is, 3,000 to 2,000 to 1,000, so on, and invite them to do the same and see what happens. So that's an alternative to having arms control treaties.
Harry.
Harry Chrysler from the Institute of International Studies. At the bottom of the list in the film was working to resolve regional conflicts. And so I want to get your thoughts about the other politics, which is a number of the actors in regions feel threatened by an adversary in the region, and until we do something about the threat that they perceive, it is very difficult to move them in the direction that you desire. What is it we can do about that? India, Pakistan, Israel, Iran, where both are looking at the other and are afraid of nuclear weapons in the hands of the other. Are there any incentives to reduce their sense of threat which impels them not to follow what you're proposing?
I wish I had more optimism on that subject. When I was the secretary, I went to Delhi and then to Islamabad. This was before they had had their nuclear tests. I knew they had nuclear programs. I knew just where they stood. And I went urging them not to conduct those tests. And the argument I used had nothing to do with proliferation or international views. I just said, I think your own security will be greatly enhanced if you do not have a test and deployment of nuclear weapons. In the case of Pakistan and India in particular, I think the danger of one of those two countries actually firing a nuclear weapon at each other is high. That if they have, I mean, they still have not even close to having resolved their dispute over Kashmir. There are Pakistani terrorist groups who are planning, as we sit here, planning further attacks on India, like the attack at Mumbai. India was very restrained after that attack, but they may not be so restrained after a second attack. And if they respond with a military incursion into Pakistan, Pakistan might feel obliged to respond nuclear. So I worry a lot about that. And the best way, I think, of discussing and debating the questions with the Israelis and with the Indians and the Pakistans is to talk to them about their own security, which is, I think, has been decreased by having nuclear weapons, not increased. But I have to say that so far all attempts I've made, and as far as I know other people have made in that regard, have not been very successful.
Are there further questions? Yes.
Hi, Colin, Berkeley alumnus. The film's vision, and I think it's a beautiful one, is ultimately for abolition of nuclear weapons altogether. Do you ever encounter the argument that prior to nuclear weapons, the face of war was so grisly and the numbers high, like in World War I, and would we ever revert to something like that? I was just wondering, how would you respond to that argument?
Yeah, the way that question is put sometime is, if we eliminate nuclear weapons, will we be making the world safe for another World War II or World War III? Of course, that isn't the idea, but that is a real possibility. In answering that, I would say that I gave a lot of pretty gloomy answer to the last question, but I will say if we look at what has happened in Europe since World War II, it's very hard to believe there would be another World War III in Europe today. The advances made since then politically, the creation of the United Nations, the creation of the European Union. So in Europe, at least, there's some sense of that we're moving away from the threat the future threat of another world war. The same is not true in Asia. But the fact that it could be done in Europe gives us some hope that can be some kind of a political reconciliation in Asia as well. At this time, I must say, for all the gloomy things in the world, for all the concerns about nuclear terrorism, for all the concerns about some regional conflicts, I see nothing in the horizon which would be leading towards another world war. The major powers, Russia, the United States, China, Japan, all of them, as I see it today, understand, are so economically interdependent that it's almost unthinkable for them to start a war against the other. Some people in the United States Congress have tried to raise the specter of a rising China, saying that threatens us in the future. The fact that China is rising does not which is true, does not necessarily mean that we are headed for a military conflict with China. And it would be a huge failure of diplomacy on the part of both countries if that were to happen. And in particular, the economic interdependence of China and the United States is such that it's hard to believe that any sane leader of either country would be able to come up with a rationale for why they should have a war with the other country. How does China, for example, satisfy the huge debt that the United States owes it by attacking us? I'd like to think that with China today we have something, during the Cold War with the Soviet Union we had mutual assured destruction. With China today we have mutual assured economic destruction. That if one of us attacks the other one, the economy of both countries collapses.
There's only time for 2 more questions. I think you've already asked the questions.
Real quick, the 3 a.m. call that you got, Mr. Secretary,
yes.
How often did stuff like that happen when you were Secretary of Defense?
There were 3 times that I am personally familiar with where we had a false alarm in the United States. I do not know how many times it might have happened in the Soviet Union, but I expect they had some too. I was not in the chain of command at the time that call came. I was the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. The general was not calling me to say, should I launch? He was calling me to say, I had this problem. I've decided it's a false alarm. I had to brief the president in the morning. Can you, for God's sakes, tell me what happened to my computer that caused this? And the answer was no, I couldn't. It took us actually 3 days to figure what had happened. In that case, it was an insidious problem. Insidious problem. If you think of the situation now. You have a system that's there to detect an ICBM being launched at you in anger, and it never happens. So how do you prepare? How do you train? How do you prepare? Well, they had a training tape. They train on the training tape, and the training tape was made to look very realistic. Well, some idiot had put the training tape in the computer instead of the operating tape. And so the training tape was simulating a launch, and it looked like the real thing. Well, it took us a couple of days to figure that out. And, stuff happens.
There's time for one question you have beyond.
Hi, Rohit Vadia, undergraduate here at Berkeley. I was wondering how viable is it for the United States to launch a cyber attack on rogue states' nuclear programs like the Stuxnet program was a few months ago?
Say it again. I think I got it, but...
Oh, okay, sorry. How viable is it for the United States to launch a cyber attack onto nuclear programs in rogue states like North Korea or Iran, like the Stuxnet program was a few months ago?
The question was about a cyber attack. And the answer to the question, is it viable? The answer is very viable. But understand that a cyber attack can be most effective against the nation that has the greatest dependence on cyber networks, which is not North Korea. It's the United States. We are the ones that are most vulnerable, and indeed, the more developed a country is, the greater its dependence on computer networks, and therefore the greatest vulnerability on computer networks. So I would say the United States has at the same time both the greatest vulnerability to a cyber attack and also probably the greatest technical capability to conduct an attack. Now, the people in the United States responsible for defending us, which is such an attack, the National Security Agency, believe that the best defense is a good offense. That is, they believe that you have to understand, you have to know how to conduct a cyber attack before you know how to defend yourself against a cyber attack. And I think they have a very good capability, but I do say our vulnerability is very, very high. There have been at least 2 instances in recent history where a nation conducted a cyber attack against another nation. In both cases, the nation was Russia, and once against Georgia and once against Estonia, and they were devastating. They basically shut those countries down for a couple of days. Our defensive capabilities are good enough that I don't think it would happen quite that way with the United States, but on the other hand, our vulnerabilities are also greater. If they could interfere with our financial networks, our transportation networks, our utility networks, you can imagine a lot of damage being done. On that happy note, thank you. Good show.
Before I thank Secretary Perry, I want to thank you all. That was a fine set of questions, briefly put, and each one ending with a question mark. It's very well done. Thank you for coming. Bill and Lee, I want to thank you for taking on Bay Area traffic to come all the way here and give an extremely useful and fine inaugural speech for our Foreign Affairs seminar.
Thank you, Harold.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you all. Bill.